Captain Maya Brooks ran through the corridors of her ship as emergency alarms screamed in her ears and red warning lights flashed against the metal walls, making everything look like it was painted in blood, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest like a drum beating out a rhythm of fear and urgency. 3 weeks ago, they had picked up a distress signal coming from deep space where no one should have been, and the signal used frequencies that humanity had never seen before, broadcasting patterns that seemed almost musical in their complexity, and Maya had made the decision to investigate because that was what explorers did when they found something new and unknown. Now half her crew was dead, and something impossible was bleeding on her medical table, and she was running toward a future that she could not predict or control or even understand, because the universe had just gotten much bigger and much stranger than anyone had ever imagined. She burst through the doors of the medical bay and stopped so suddenly that Lieutenant Sophie Grant almost crashed into her from behind, and Maya just stood there staring at what lay on the examination table because her brain was trying to process something that should not exist in any rational universe. The woman on the table had skin that glowed with a soft inner light like captured moonbeams, and her hair was silver white spreading across the metal surface like liquid mercury frozen in time, and her ears were pointed sweeping back from her elegant face in graceful curves that reminded Maya of ancient fairy tales her grandmother used to tell when she was just a little girl. Dr. Lily Carter worked over the wounds with steady hands, but Maya could see the tremor in her fingers and the paleness of her face as she tried to make sense of anatomy that followed rules different from anything in her medical textbooks and training manuals. Maya stepped closer, and her boots made soft sounds on the floor, and she could see the wings, now translucent and gossamer thin, folded against the table but torn and bleeding, and they looked like they were made from spider silk and starlight woven together by impossible magic. This was an elf, Maya thought, and the word felt ridiculous in her mind because elves were not real. They were stories from old Earth legends about magical beings who lived in forests and spoke to animals and had powers beyond human understanding. A low, dangerous growl made Maya spin around with her hand going to the weapon at her hip, and there, in the shadows of the medical bay, was something even more impossible than the elf, because a dragon coiled in the corner with scales that looked like polished obsidian and eyes that burned with golden fire. The dragon was huge, filling the back third of the medical bay, and smoke curled from its nostrils as it watched Maya and her crew with intelligence that was clearly not animal, but something ancient and aware and utterly alien. Lieutenant Sophie Grant stood in the doorway, still wearing her tactical armor scorched black from the rescue mission, and she reported in a shaky voice that they had found the elf and her dragon in an escape pod that was falling apart, and their ship had been torn to pieces by weapons that made human plasma cannons look like children throwing rocks. The enemy ships had vanished into slipspace before the rescue team could get a good scan, but Sophie had managed to capture some sensor data, and when Maya looked at the readouts, her blood turned to ice because she recognized the signatures. For 5 years, humanity had been losing colonies at the edge of explored space, with ships and settlements going dark without warning, and the few distress signals they recovered spoke of vessels that moved like living things, and weapons that dissolved matter, and an enemy that took no prisoners. Maya had lost friends to those attacks, had attended memorial services for crews who vanished without trace, had watched the fear grow in human space as more and more people went missing, and now she knew what they were facing. The dragon suddenly roared, and the restraining field around it sparked and failed, and the security team raised their weapons, but Maya held up her hand, telling them to stand down, because the dragon was not attacking them. It was trying to reach the elf on the table, and as Maya watched, the massive creature moved with surprising gentleness, pressing its enormous head against the elf hand where it hung limp over the edge of the examination table. The elf eyes suddenly opened, glowing with inner light that made everyone in the medical bay take a step back, and she tried to sit up, but her wounds were too severe, and she gasped out a single word in a language Maya should not have understood, but somehow did Kaida the elf said, and the dragon made a sound that was part growl and part whimper, and somehow Maya knew that was the dragon name. Dr. Carter tried to get the elf to lie back down, but the injured woman ignored her completely and ran her hands over the dragon scales, checking for injuries with desperate urgency, and, speaking in that liquid musical language that flowed like water over smooth stones, Maya watched them together and saw something in the way they moved and touched and looked at each other that transcended species or biology or anything she could explain with science or reason. This was a bond, she realized, deeper than friendship or loyalty or even family, and these two beings were connected in ways that made them less like rider and mount and more like two halves of the same soul. The elf finally seemed satisfied that her dragon was not seriously hurt, and she turned to look at Maya with eyes that were ancient beyond measure, filled with sorrow and pain, and a weariness that spoke of battles fought across centuries. She asked in heavily accented but understandable English why the humans had saved them when they could have left them to die in the cold darkness of space and taken no risk to themselves. Maya answered simply that it was what humans did because when someone needed help, you helped them, and you did not ask for payment or expect gratitude, you just did what was right, because that was what being human meant. The elf studied Maya for a long moment as if weighing her soul, and then she introduced herself as Lyra Silvermoon, last daughter of the Ether Court, and gestured to the dragon saying this was Kaida. Her bonded companion Lyra explained that she and Kaida had been flying between the stars since before Maya ancestors learned to make fire, and they were fighting a war that had raged for 3,000 human years against an enemy called the Devourers, who consumed everything in their path. The Devourers did not negotiate or take prisoners or show mercy because they were not truly alive in the way other species understood life, but something else entirely, something hungry and vast and utterly without compassion or conscience. Her people, the Ether-born, had been fighting the Devourers for millennia, protecting younger races and holding back the darkness so that species like humanity could grow and thrive and reach for the stars without being consumed before they ever left their home worlds. But now, the Etherborn were losing, and their great fleets had been shattered, and their worlds had burned, and only a few hundred bonded pairs remained scattered across the galaxy, fighting a desperate rearguard action against an enemy that could not be stopped. And the Devourers had found humanity. Maya felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders like a physical burden, and she asked how they could fight such an enemy. And Lyra laughed, but it was a bitter sound without humor. You cannot fight them. Lyra said you can only survive and run and hide unless you find allies who still remember how to resist and who are brave enough or foolish enough to stand against the darkness even when defeat seems inevitable. Then Lyra asked if humans were willing to stand with the dying remnants of an ancient civilization, or if they would choose to run and hide and hope that the Devourers would consume someone else first. Maya thought about the 60,000 civilians aboard her ship and all the human colonies spread across space and Earth itself, so far away and so vulnerable to an enemy they did not even know existed. She thought about her crew who had signed up to explore new worlds and discover new species, not to fight in ancient wars against impossible enemies. But she also thought about the elf lying wounded on her medical table, and the dragon who would die before abandoning its bonded companion, and the 3,000 years of resistance that had bought humanity time to grow. Maya said that humans had always been good at being brave and foolish, usually at the same time, and if Lyra people needed allies, then they had found them. Lyra smiled for the first time since waking, and it transformed her face from merely beautiful to something that made Maya's heart ache, and she said that perhaps there was hope after all, though she warned that hope was a dangerous thing. In times like these, Maya pulled up a chair and sat down beside the medical bed, while Kaida curled protectively around both of them, and she asked Lyra to tell her everything from the beginning. And so Lyra began to speak, weaving a tale of ancient empires and impossible wars of bonds between riders and dragons that transcended death itself, of enemies that devoured worlds and left nothing but silence in their wake. Maya listened and understood that humanity had stumbled into something far bigger than exploration or discovery, and they could no longer pretend that the universe was safe, or that they could remain neutral in conflicts that spanned galaxies. The darkness had found them, and now they had to choose whether to fight or flee, whether to stand with allies they barely knew against enemies they did not understand. And sitting there in that medical bay surrounded by the impossible made real, Maya Brooks made her choice for herself and for her species. They would fight. The War Council assembled in the main conference room looked like something from a dream or nightmare. With human officers on one side of the holographic table and Lyra Silvermoon on the other with her dragon. Kaida lying beside her chair taking up half the available floor space. Commander Victoria Hayes could not stop staring at the dragon because her mind kept insisting that dragons were not real, even though the evidence of her eyes told her otherwise, and she had to keep reminding herself that the universe was stranger than anyone had imagined. Lyra pulled up holographic displays that interfaced seamlessly with the human systems, despite being based on completely different technology, and the images that appeared above the table made several officers gasp or curse under their breath. The ships looked wrong somehow, like they had been grown rather than built, with organic curves that twisted in ways that hurt to look at and surfaces that seemed to writhe even in the frozen images. Lyra explained that the devourers came from somewhere else, from a dimension where the normal rules of physics did not apply, and consciousness itself was just another form of energy to be consumed, and they had learned over eons to build ships from the remains of worlds they had eaten. The devourers moved in swarms connected by a hive intelligence that spanned light years, and they could not be reasoned with because they did not see other species as people, but only as food and resources to be harvested. Lieutenant Nina Foster asked how you killed them, and Lyra answered flatly that you did not, at least not easily, because their ships regenerated damage, and destroying one vessel barely slowed the swarm, and their weapons unmade matter at the quantum level. There was no defense against those weapons. Lyra said no shield that could stop them. You survived by not being hit at all, by being faster and smarter and more desperate than the enemy. Commander Victoria muttered that this was not exactly a winning strategy, and Kaida lifted her massive head, and suddenly everyone in the room felt something pressing against their minds. Not quite thoughts, but emotions and impressions. Maya gasped because she could feel the dragon consciousness touching hers, ancient and vast and utterly alien, but also somehow familiar in its fierce protectiveness and determination. Lyra translated, saying that Kaida believed humans misunderstood the nature of this war because the devourers won by fighting like a disease, overwhelming everything through sheer numbers and relentless advance, but you could defeat them by fighting like fire. Lyra continued striking fast and fierce and burning so bright that even the darkness had to retreat. At least for a while, Maya asked how many ether-born warriors remained, and Lyra was silent for a long moment before answering that 3 years ago they had numbered 10,000 bonded pairs, warriors who had trained for centuries and dragons who had lived for millennia. Now perhaps 300 pairs remained scattered across the galaxy, hiding and running and fighting desperate rear-guard actions. The devourers had learned to target the bonds between riders and dragons. Lyra explained, using weapons that killed both simultaneously and turned their greatest strength into their most terrible vulnerability. Maya said that despite everything, Lyra was still fighting, and Lyra replied, what choice did they have? because for 10,000 years the Etherborn had protected the younger races, holding back the darkness, so species like humanity could grow. They had failed, but they would not surrender while a single bonded pair still drew breath. Nina asked about the bond between Lyra and Kaida, and Lyra's face softened as she explained that Kaida was not a pet or a mount or a weapon, but her partner and companion and other half. When they bonded, their souls intertwined, so that Lyra felt what Kaida felt and knew what she knew, and Kaida's strength became Lyra's strength, and together they were something greater than either could ever be alone. The dragon rumbled and Lyra smiled, translating that Kaida thought humans understood bonds better than expected, because humans had something similar that they called love. The way people bound themselves to each other and became stronger together than they ever were apart. Before Maya could respond to that, the ship emergency alarms erupted into sound and red lights began flashing, and Sophie's voice came over the intercom, reporting multiple contacts dropping out of slip space. Maya ordered battle stations, and the conference room emptied in seconds with officers running to their posts, and Lyra struggled to stand, despite her wounds, but Kaida moved beneath her hand, supporting her weight. Maya hesitated, torn between her duty to her ship and the instinct to help the wounded elf, but Lyra insisted that her place was on the bridge, because Maya crew needed someone who knew how the Devourers fought. Maya made a decision that could have gotten her court-martialed under normal circumstances and told Nina to get Lyra and Kaida to the hangar bay because they needed the dragon in the fight. The bridge was controlled chaos when Maya arrived with her crew working with the efficiency that came from years of training, and on the main view screen she saw the enemy for the first time. The Devourer ships looked even worse in motion than they had in the static images, with surfaces that pulsed and twisted and seemed almost alive in the way they moved through space. Victoria reported that the enemy was targeting their engines, trying to cripple the human ship so it could not escape, and Maya ordered all power diverted to weapons because she refused to run. 30 seconds later, Kaida launched from the hangar bay, and her roar was so loud it shook the entire ship, and Maya watched on the view screen as the dragon shot into space with wings that should not work in vacuum, somehow propelling her forward with impossible speed. Nina's voice came over the comm channel saying that the dragon was generating some kind of field around herself that read like atmosphere, but that should be impossible according to every law of physics. They understood Maya said it was magic because they were dealing with actual magic now, and Nina replied that she was adjusting her worldview accordingly, and would someone please update the science textbooks when this was over. Kaida dove toward the nearest Devourer ship, moving with grace that belied her enormous size, and Lyra's voice came across the tactical channel telling Maya to fire now. While the enemy attention was divided, Maya ordered all plasma cannons to fire, and the ship weapons blazed with blue-white light striking the Devourer vessel at the exact moment that Kaida claws raked across its hull. But the dragon attack was not just physical, Maya realized as she watched, because where Kaida struck, reality itself seemed to bend and tear like fabric being ripped, and the enemy ship did not just take damage, but unmade itself, dissolving into nothing as if it had never existed. The battle became a nightmare of movement and fire with the human ship, using every evasion tactic Maya had ever learned, while Kaida became a living weapon among the enemy vessels. But there were 8 Devourer ships, and they were learning and adapting and forming a pattern to trap the dragon. And Maya knew they had to do something, or Kaida would be overwhelmed. She ordered maximum power to the engines and plotted a course straight through the enemy formation, and Victoria protested that they would be in point-blank range of 6 hostile ships. Maya said she knew and ordered them to do it anyway. The ship accelerated with engines screaming in protest and shields dropping rapidly under enemy fire, and Sophie called out percentages as their defenses failed: 40%, then 30, then 20. Maya held course as they plunged into the center of the enemy formation, and for one terrible moment they were surrounded by ships that existed only to consume and destroy. Then Kaida shot through the gap Maya had created with wings folded tight, and as she passed the human ship, her tail lashed out, striking one devourer vessel so hard it tumbled away. Trailing debris, Maya ordered full retreat, and they ran with engines glowing cherry red from the heat, while Kaida harried the pursuing ships from behind, until finally they lost the enemy in the magnetic field of a gas giant. Later in the medical bay, Maya found Lyra exhausted and pale, and Kaida wounded with several scales cracked and bleeding, but both alive. Maya said they should all be dead, and Lyra replied, "Welcome to war against the Devourers, where every day you survived felt like a miracle, and every battle you won was borrowed time." She said Maya crew had fought well, and the decision to charge into danger to save Kaida was not the action of a young race still learning to walk among the stars. Maya said simply that they took care of their own, and right now that included Lyra and Kaida. Lyra reached out and took Maya's hand in hers and said that during the battle Maya had called her partner, and in the Etherborn language that word meant more than ally. It meant bonded by choice, someone who stood with you not from duty, but from loyalty. Freely given, Maya started to stammer an explanation, but Lyra smiled and said she understood what Maya had meant, and she accepted the bond. From that moment forward, humanity and the Etherborn were bound by more than circumstance, Lyra said, and together they would do what neither could accomplish alone. Not just survive, but win. The ship drifted in the shadow of a dead world that Lyra called Silverfall. And through the viewport, Maya could see the planet's surface scarred and lifeless. Where once cities had stood and gardens had bloomed, Lyra stood beside her looking down at her lost home, and her voice was barely a whisper as she explained that 3 million souls had lived on Silverfall, the finest scholars and artists and dragon keepers in all the Etherborn civilization. The Devourers had come without warning and taken them all in a single day, and every bonded pair across the galaxy had felt those deaths like knives stabbing into their hearts. Sophie's voice broke the heavy silence, reporting a faint signal, coming from the fourth moon, and Lyra's head snapped up with hope and fear warring on her face. She said it might be Sanctuary Station, a hidden refuge they had built after the first Devourer attacks, a place where those too young or too wounded to fight could shelter and survive. They approached the moon slowly with every sensor active scanning for any sign of enemy presence, because Maya would not lead the Devourers to survivors if any remained. The moon resolved on their screens as a barren rock pockmarked with impact craters, but as they descended into one of the deeper canyons, Maya saw a shimmer in the air like heat haze. Nina reported it was a camouflage field incredibly sophisticated, and if they had not been looking specifically for it, their sensors would have dismissed it as natural magnetic distortion. They landed in what had once been a garden, now overgrown and wild, but still beautiful in its own way, and Maya accompanied Lyra and Kaida down the boarding ramp with a security team, following close behind the Etherborn, who emerged from the sanctuary buildings made Maya heartbreak, because there were perhaps 70 of them, and most bore injuries or the hollow look of people who had lost everything. But it was the children that struck Maya deepest with their wide eyes and pointed ears, and small dragons barely larger than house cats clinging to them. A woman stepped forward with silver hair bound in warrior braids and one arm ending in a bandaged stump, and she greeted Lyra saying they had felt her bond with Kaida burning like a beacon across the stars. The woman introduced herself as Commander Helen Stormwind, and Lyra embraced her carefully, and then gestured to Maya and her crew. Lyra explained that these were humans, a young race from a distant part of the galaxy, and they had saved her life and chosen to stand with the Etherborn against the darkness. The survivors stared at the humans with expressions ranging from disbelief to desperate hope, and a young girl tugged on Lyra's sleeve and asked in her musical language if the humans were going to help fight the bad things. Lyra knelt down to the child level and said, Yes, the humans would help, and the girl pointed out logically that humans did not have dragons, so how could they possibly fight? Kaida rumbled low in her chest and lowered her massive head to nuzzle the child gently, and then the dragon turned her golden eyes on Maya, and something passed between them. Lyra stood slowly and said that Kaida was asking something unprecedented, something that had never been done in 10,000 years of ether-born history. She asked if humans could bond with dragons. The words seemed to hang in the air, and Maya felt every eye turn toward her. Both human and ether-born waiting to see how she would respond, Maya asked what bonding would involve, and Lyra took her hand, explaining that it meant opening yourself completely, letting down every wall and defense you had ever built. Dragons saw the truth of who you were. Lyra said all your courage and all your fear, your nobility and your failings, and most people could not bear that kind of vulnerability. But those who could bear it became legends. Helen spoke up, saying they had 6 unbonded dragons at the Sanctuary Warriors, whose riders had fallen at Silverfall, and who had been trapped here ever since because they refused to abandon the children. And they had 23 young ones who would never grow to be riders, because there were no dragons left for them to bond with. Maya said she needed to talk to her crew because this was not an order she could give, but a choice each person had to make for themselves. The assembly gathered in the main hangar bay, and Maya stood on a cargo platform, looking out at the faces of people who trusted her to lead them. She told them honestly that what Lyra was offering sounded insane, to bond with alien creatures and fight in a war that had been lost for 3,000 years. But she had seen what the Devourers did to worlds, and she had seen what bonded pairs could accomplish when they fought together. Maya said they had come to explore and find new life, and they had found it, and it needed them not because humans were special, but because they were here and willing to try. She asked anyone willing to attempt a bond to step forward, and after a moment of hesitation, Sophie moved out of the crowd. Then Victoria followed, and Nina and others, until 37 crew members stood separate from the rest. Lyra moved among the volunteers, studying each one with her ancient eyes, and occasionally asking quiet questions or placing a hand on their shoulders. Finally, she nodded and said that 6 of them resonated with the potential for bonding, and the others' courage was no less for not matching with these particular dragons. Sophie was paired with a bronze dragon named Ember, and Victoria with a massive silver dragon called Storm, and Nina with a clever green dragon named Whisper. Maya had not volunteered because she thought it inappropriate for the captain to take such a risk. But Lyra approached her anyway. Lyra said that leading meant standing with your people, not above them, and a 7th dragon emerged from the shadows. This dragon was smaller than Kaida, but equally magnificent, with scales that shifted between blue and black like the depths of an ocean. Lyra explained that this was Azure, who had been companion to her sister and had been alone for 5 years, refusing to bond, again, refusing to let anyone close. Azure regarded Maya with eyes the color of deep water, and Maya felt seen in a way that made her want to hide and stand tall simultaneously. She reached out without conscious thought, and when her hand touched the dragon scales, the world exploded into sensation. Maya was falling into forever, with every wall she had ever built crumbling away, and she felt azure grief for her lost rider, and loneliness, and desperate need for connection. But she also felt azure terror of losing someone again, of opening her heart only to have it shattered. Then something shifted, and where their hearts touched, a warmth bloomed, spreading through them both. Maya felt azure strength flowing into her, ancient and vast and utterly loyal. And Azure felt Maya determination and compassion and fierce protective instinct for those she led. When Maya opened her eyes, she was lying on the hangar floor with tears streaming down her face, laughing and sobbing. At the same time, Azure head rested on her chest, and the dragon eyes held warmth and amusement and acceptance. Maya gasped yes to everything. Yes to the bond and the partnership and whatever came next. Across the hangar, the other bondings were completing, with some succeeding as human and dragon found resonance, and others failing, but without shame. By the time the sun rose over the sanctuary, 6 humans had bonded with dragons, and humanity had its first dragon riders. They were people who would never again be entirely human, and dragons who had found unexpected partners in a young race. It was not enough to win a war, but it was a beginning, and in the darkness between stars, something ancient and hungry felt the shift. For the first time in 3,000 years, the Devourer's endless advance hesitated because something was changing, and even nightmares could learn to fear. The fleet that assembled at the edge of explored space looked like something from a fever dream, with human warships flying in formation alongside ether-born dragon wings, and at the center was the Vanguard, a massive carrier built specifically to house dragon-bonded riders. Maya stood in the observation deck with Azure coiled beside her, feeling their bond hum with anticipation, like a guitar string pulled taut and waiting to be played. Below, in the converted hangar bays, 5 other human dragon pairs prepared for what everyone was calling Operation Dawnbreak, which was an absurdly optimistic name for what was essentially a desperate gambit. Sophie reported that all wings were in position, and Maya pulled up the tactical display, seeing the forces arrayed across the star system that the Ether-born called Nexus Prime. Once it had been the capital of their empire, where 100 billion souls lived in cities that touched the clouds, and now it was a graveyard. Silent and empty, intelligence suggested the Devourers were using the dead world as a staging ground, and Maya intended to take it back. She gave the order to commence the assault, and the attack began. With humanity, newest weapons that Nina had designed. They were called reality anchors, and they worked by stabilizing local space-time, forcing the Devourers to fight in the physical realm where they could actually be hit and damaged. As the anchors activated, Maya felt through Azure senses how space crystallized, becoming sharp and defined, where it had been fluid and uncertain. Victoria's voice came across the comm reporting, Devourer fleet, responding with a count of 73 vessels, and Maya felt a moment of fear before she looked at her own forces, 220 human ships and 96 ether-born wings and 18 human bonded pairs. For the first time since this war began, they actually had numbers on their side. Maya ordered all dragons free to engage, and Azure launched from the deck with a roar that resonated across multiple dimensions. Maya felt their bond sing as they dove into battle, with Azure ancient instincts guiding their movements, while Maya tactical mind planned 3 steps ahead. The battle was chaos made manifest, with human ships using tactics adapted from centuries of naval warfare, and ether-born dragons moving through the void as easily as birds through atmosphere. Everywhere, the human-bonded pairs acted as force multipliers, allowing human and ether-born forces to coordinate with unprecedented precision. Maya lost herself in the flow of combat, diving through crossfire and striking at weak points with azure claws raking across enemy hulls. But then Nina's voice cut through the bond, saying she and Whisper had detected something on the planet's surface. A structure heavily shielded that looked like a Devourer command center, hidden beneath what had once been the Grand Library. Maya pulled data from Nina's sensors and saw it pulsing with power, and she knew instantly that if they could destroy it, they might cripple the enemy entire sector. She ordered Sophie to provide cover and told Nina to come with her because they were going planet-side. They descended through hell with weapons, fire streaking past, and 3 human ships died, providing them a corridor, and Maya honored their sacrifice by not hesitating. They landed in the ruins of the library, and Maya unsealed her helmet to breathe air that smelled of ash and forgotten dreams. Nina pointed to a structure that looked like it was growing out of the library foundation, organic and mechanical merged together in the distinctive devourer-style azure, and Whisper approached it with tense bodies, and through the bond Maya felt azure recognition. This was more than a command center. It was a hive node where the devourers were trying to establish permanent presence to transform the world into a breeding ground. Maya asked if they could destroy it, and Azure turned her ocean-deep eyes on her companion. To unmake something this deeply rooted Azure sent through their bond would require a bonded pair to merge completely with the ether. Maya understood what that meant, and Nina did too, and they both went pale. It would kill the pair that attempted it. Before Maya could speak, Lyra's voice cut across the bond network, and Kaida descended from above, landing with enough force to crack the stone. Lyra dismounted and moved to stand before Maya with fierce intensity in her ancient eyes. She said Maya was not dying today, and neither was Nina, because they were too valuable, and more than that Maya was her partner. Maya asked what else they could do, and Lyra said they would use the option the Etherborn had been avoiding for 3,000 years. She would sever her bond with Kaida, permanently giving the dragon power to become pure ether long enough to unmake the hive node. Maya protested immediately, but Lyra said there was no other way, because some things could only be paid for with loss. She touched Maya's face gently and asked her to remember that this was a choice, and standing with humanity and seeing what their civilizations could become together was worth everything. Before Maya could argue, Lyra turned to Kaida, and they began a ritual that was simple and heartbreaking. Two beings who had been one for over a century, deliberately severing the connection that defined them both. Maya felt it through the bond network, felt every dragon and rider cry out in empathic anguish as the tether between Lyra and Kaida was cut. Kaida screamed, and the sound shattered stone and made reality itself weep. In that moment of separation, the ancient dragon became something else, a being of pure creative force existing across dimensions simultaneously. She fell upon the hive node like justice given form, and where she touched the devourer structure, did not just die, but cease to have ever existed. Reality rewrote itself, rejecting the intrusion, and when it was over, Kaida collapsed with dimming scales. She had survived, but something fundamental had changed, and she was no longer bonded but alone, in a way no dragon should ever be. Lyra stood apart, and her face showed loss so profound that Maya could not find words. The elf had lost her other half, the connection that had defined her. Existence for over a century, Maya wanted to rage against the unfairness. But the battle above still raged, and they had achieved their objective, even if the cost made victory taste like ashes. The Allied fleet won the Battle of Nexus Prime with 73 Devourer vessels destroyed against 40 human ships and 12 ether-borne wings lost. By the mathematics of war, it was a resounding victory. But that night, Maya sat beside Lyra in the observation deck, watching work crews begin reclaiming the planet, and victory felt hollow. Maya said she was sorry, and Lyra replied not to be, because she had made a choice. She had given everything so that something better might survive. Lyra said unbonded elves could still fight and command and matter. Maya said fiercely that Lyra had always mattered. Lyra smiled, sad but genuine, and said, "Yes, dear," because Maya had shown her that worth was not measured by power or bonds, but by the choices made and the people chosen to stand with. Over the following weeks, the war tide continued shifting because the Devourers could not adapt to fighting bonded pairs who used human tactics. Victoria and Storm became instructors training new generations, even though Storm damaged wing meant they flew slower. Nina and Whisper pioneered new technologies blending human engineering with ether-borne science. Sophie and Ember formed scout wings that could detect enemy movements days before they arrived, and Maya, with Azure and Lyra as her constant companion, led the Allied fleet from victory to victory. Each battle was hard-fought and paid for with lives that could never be replaced, but they were winning. The day they reclaimed the human colony of New Horizon was the day Maya finally believed they might actually win this war. She stood on the restored surface, with Lyra beside her, and behind them, the Vanguard hung in orbit, surrounded by the largest gathering of Allied ships ever assembled. The colony had been one of the first human worlds the Devourers consumed 5 years ago, and everyone thought it was lost forever. But now children played in the streets again, and the air smelled of growing things instead of death. Maya said they were going to win not as a question, but as a statement of fact, and Lyra agreed without hesitation. Not today, she said, and not tomorrow, because the Devourers still controlled vast territories and would fight for every world, but yes, eventually they would win. Lyra said that Maya and her absurd young race with only 300 years of spaceflight had taught beings who lived for millennia something they had forgotten, that hope was not naive, and standing together was not weakness, and choosing to fight, when losing seemed inevitable, was not foolishness, but courage. Maya thought about the long road they had traveled from that first desperate rescue to this moment of genuine hope. She thought about Victoria and Storm still flying, despite injuries that would never fully heal. She thought about Sophie and Ember, whose trust had been forged in the fire of near death. She thought about the children at the sanctuary who now had human aunts and uncles teaching them games from Earth. Maya turned to face Lyra fully and asked, not as a joke, but seriously, if she would stand with humanity not just for this war, but for whatever came after. Would Lyra help them build something new from the ashes of what the Devourers had destroyed? Lyra's eyes widened as she understood the depth of what Maya was offering, not just an alliance for the duration of a conflict, but a joining of civilizations. Yes, Lyra said simply, partner in war and in peace, until the last star fades. They sealed the partnership there on the reclaimed world, and above them, Azure roared approval, while the Allied fleet collective cheer echoed across the bond network. The war continued for 3 more years, with battles won and lost, and the slow grinding advance of Allied forces pushing the Devourers back sector by sector. There were dark days when it seemed they might still lose, when entire fleets vanished and worlds burned despite their best efforts. But there were also victories, small and large, as more human dragon pairs bonded and new technologies emerged from the collaboration between species. The Ether-born, who had been dying, found new purpose in teaching and protecting and building alongside humanity. And humans, who had thought they were alone in the universe, discovered they were part of something vast and ancient and worth preserving. Maya and Lyra became symbols of that partnership. The human captain and the unbonded elf who led their peoples together. Azure and Maya bond grew deeper with each passing year, until sometimes Maya could not tell where she ended and the dragon began. Lyra never bonded again, but she found purpose in command and strategy, becoming one of the most respected leaders in the Allied forces. And Kaida, though forever alone, chose to become a teacher, sharing her ancient wisdom with young dragons and humans alike. The turning point came in the 5th year of the war, when a joint human ether-born research team discovered the Devourer weakness. They were not actually from another dimension, but from this one, from a species that had evolved on the edge of a black hole, where time and space worked differently. And like all evolved things, they could be understood and countered. The weapon that finally broke the Devourer advance was not based on force or violence, but on harmony. It created fields of stabilized space-time, that the devourers could not enter because their biology required the fluid, uncertain nature of normal space. With these harmony fields protecting key systems, the devourers could no longer advance, and their hive mind began to fragment. The final battle took place at the edge of the galaxy, where the last Devourer fleet had retreated. Maya led the assault personally with Azure at her side, and Lyra commanding the tactical operations from the vanguard. The battle lasted 3 days, and cost them dearly, with hundreds of ships destroyed and dozens of bonded pairs falling. But when it was over, the Devourer threat was ended. Not destroyed entirely because that would have been impossible, but pushed back beyond the galactic rim and contained the Allied fleet returned home exhausted and battered, but victorious. 20 years after that final battle, Maya Brooks stood in the Hall of Bonds, a structure built on Nexus Prime, to honor every partnership between human and dragon, and between all the peoples who had stood against the darkness. Beside her, Lyra Silvermoon looked barely aged. Despite 2 decades passing, and even unbonded, she retained that timeless quality that made it impossible to guess her true age. Maya asked if Lyra regretted it, and Lyra considered the question seriously. She said she regretted nothing, even though she missed Kaida every day with an ache that never faded. But regret no, because look at what they had built. Maya looked and saw human children playing with ether-born youngsters, while adolescent dragons basked in artificial sunlight. She saw Victoria helping new bonded pairs through their first flight training. She saw Nina presenting breakthroughs to councils of scientists from both species working in collaboration. She saw Sophie leading ceremonies that honored both human and ether-born traditions, creating something new from old faiths. And there, in the center of the hall, Kaida rested surrounded by unbonded dragons and humans who came to hear her stories. The ancient dragon had become a teacher, finding purpose, even without her rider. Maya said, "Yes, dear," softly taking Lyra hand in hers and seeing everything they had chosen to become. In the Hall of Bonds, 2 civilizations built their shared future together. The Age of Legends had truly begun, and the darkness that once seemed unstoppable had been pushed back by the simple choice to stand together. Maya and Lyra grew old together as much as an elf could age, and they watched their peoples merge not into one civilization, but into a partnership where each retained their identity while becoming stronger together. Azure lived for another century after Maya's death, protecting Maya's children and grandchildren with the same fierce loyalty she had shown her bonded. And when Azure finally passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by those she loved, the entire galaxy mourned. Lyra Silvermoon lived to see humanity, and the ether-born spread across 3 galaxies, building worlds and raising children who knew both dragon song and human laughter. She lived to see the day when asking whether someone was human or ether-born seemed as meaningless as asking whether they preferred sunrise or sunset. And when she finally laid down to rest in the Hall of Bonds with Kaida waiting to greet her, she did so, knowing that the choice she and Maya had made all those years ago in a medical bay had changed everything they had chosen to try, and that had made all the difference.